this meeting.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, with that, well, it's, as you say, 12:01, maybe 12:02 now, so let's call the meeting to order. And I want to welcome and thank you for attending. This is a public meeting, and as just noted, it is being recorded for future access. Just to remind you, this meeting is scheduled for 1.5 hours, so it should end by 1:30, and I'll try my very best to make sure it's no later than that. Angela, just for the record, could you take a roll of the members? I think there's only 3 of us, so.
Thank you, Chairman. So I do only see Town of Hillsborough.
Present.
City of Daly City.
Pamela DiGiovanni, present.
And then just as staff from the San Francisco Board of Supervisors.
Present.
Thank you. And we do have Linda Wolin from Supervisor Pine office, also as staff, not a voting member.
She's a Congresswoman aide, Congresswoman Spears.
Okay, and I see Kathleen and Brian are here. Welcome.
And also Sarah Aptekin from our DC office.
Oh, Sarah. Okay, welcome. Do we have everybody? And I see Jean and Bert are here. Anybody else? So, okay, good. Well, let the record show we do have a quorum. And hopefully Ann will be joining us shortly. She normally does not miss these meetings. First thing on the agenda, obviously, is public comment for anyone to comment on any matter not on the agenda. As you note, we are on Zoom, which is the modus operandi nowadays. If you wish to comment, please either raise your hand by the raise hand feature, or if you can push *9 on your telephone keypad, and then in response, we'll unmute you and give you up to 2 minutes to speak on a single comment on any items not on the agenda. Angela, do we have any hands raised?
Thank you, Chairman. I do see one hand raised by Mr. Robert Holbrook. So give me 1 second so I can share the timer.
Okay. Mr. Holbrook, if you're unmuted, the floor is yours.
I'll be brief because I don't know to what extent this is a legislative issue, but I do remain concerned that the FAA is down a path of concentrating flight traffic in the approaches to airports using technology that's going to be or that they're intending to introduce over, say, the next 5 years or so. And that concentration, if it achieves the objectives, would affect perhaps half the traffic coming from the south going into SFO. It's a significant concern. I think that if this were to pan out the way the FAA hopes to, there would be a great uproar in the community. And whether this is something that the Ledge Committee should consider or not, I'll leave to your discussion, but I think it's a significant issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mr. Holbrook. I'm not familiar with the specifics of what you're mentioning. If you have anything, if you could present it or just send me a quick note. It may be a topic for a future meeting under the future topics section. So thank you for commenting. Are there other hands raised, Angela?
Chairman, we do not have any more hands raised from the public.
Okay, great. With that, we'll close the public comment and move into the next section of the meeting. Typically, we have a chairman's update, a follow-up from the last meeting. I have really nothing to report. Last meeting was primarily informational, and we did follow through on that. So nothing to report per se. So the basic agenda is listed on the package sent to you. First item, there's really four basic topics. One's a federal legislative update, and there's some items there we wanted to discuss. Secondly is a discussion around state and local legislation and what our role should be. Third is this information only, a letter sent by the Ground-Based Noise Subcommittee. And fourth is a discussion on future topics, what we should be addressing going forward. So the first item is federal legislation. There's three categories there that we wanted to discuss for this meeting. The first is an update on the bills introduced by Congresswoman Spire. As you may be aware, Jackie's been very active in assisting us in presenting a number of bills. They have been reintroduced again this session. We have Kathleen with us today to sort of walk us through those bills. Brian, I know, is there as well to give us an update. I really would like to focus on a couple items as we go through these bills. Not only what they say, but secondarily, if there's anything missing that we think we should lobby for to be introduced. And secondly, as you go through, what role we should be playing in trying to assist on these bills. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So with that, Kathleen, can I turn over to you? We'll have to unmute you. There you go.
Absolutely.
Welcome.
Thank you, Al. Just to briefly start out, we have just seen a press release issued by the Congresswoman late yesterday, announcing that she has indeed introduced these 8 pieces of legislation, and that press release is also available on her website to any members of the public who weren't on the email chain this morning. Also, just with me today is Brian Perkins, and he is our District Director of the San Mateo District Office for the Congresswoman. And Sarah Aptekin is in our District of Columbia, Washington office. So Brian and I will speak briefly about the bills, and then we'll ask Sarah to give us kind of a perspective from the Capitol of how these things take shape and what other options might be out there and how it's all going. So I'd ask Brian if you'd start off and just tell us about a few of the bills, and then I'll take for the second half of the bills.
Thank you, Kathleen. How things take shape, I guess we're all familiar with the old aphorism that you never want to watch 2 things being made, sausage and law. So how things did. But Mr. Chairman, you alluded to one of the reasons that these things took shape, and that is anything missing for you folks to try to ask for. And these were all the outcome of what folks were asking for in the time, which was around 2019 pre-COVID. But of course, they remain highly relevant because we are in abnormal times. Getting airport noise relief by having a massive economic collapse, that's a really bad way to have it, and a lethal pandemic. Those are both bad ways to get airport noise relief. So the first bill that I want to go over is one which we call the SNORE Act. We have these names so that we can remind ourselves about what these are about. But this bill would require SFO to actually noise insulate between, 200 or more houses per year. The present plans, at least back in 2019, were between 60 and 80. The airport at the time noted that, at least according to their estimates and in opposition to the bill, that it would cost about $25 million per year. But the point of the bill was not only to expand the number of houses that were going to be noise mitigated, but also to expand the boundary lines so that they just didn't have to be within the 65 CNEL boundary. And so there's new provisions where this bill to be enacted. There would be new provisions for determining who it is, who would be eligible. And basically this is based upon a single event kind of metric so that we could identify the true human experience and whether or not houses thereby have to be noise mitigated. As Kathleen has instructed me, the FAA did a study about its current 65 CNEL boundary methodology and the whole standard, and determined, not surprisingly, that after all these years, they realized they've been working off of a standard that's grossly deficient relative to human experience. So you might say that we were in the forefront in putting that into print, because this is basically a condemnation, this bill, a condemnation of the existing standard for determining what constitutes a noise impact. So that particular bill is HR 4931. Are there any questions? Happy to answer them at this point. But
sure, we'll just take briefly questions, and maybe at the end we'll just summarize questions. Pam, do you have any questions?
No, not at this time. Just probably at the end, as you said, Chair. Thank you for asking. Thank you, Mr. Perkins.
Okay.
And I don't think Ann's on yet. So any questions from the staff? Okay, hearing none, Brian, we'll proceed. I'm guessing we may get most of them at the end.
Okay.
I'll cover more than one. But by the way, if I can note, for those people with the packet, this is included in your packet, I think on page 3 of your packet, a brief summary of the bills.
And I do think
and
this is something that we get quite a lot of calls about, is people who are being affected by noise but are outside the 65 CNEL. So this is particularly appropriate.
Right. The second bill we call the REST Act, and it's HR 4929. And there is a lack of federal law that allows the airport itself to establish standards around curfews. And it's wrong to say there's a lack of federal law. There's very clear federal law that they can't impose curfews. And the Congresswoman feels strongly that this is inappropriate. Prior to this 1990 law, airports were in fact able to impose their own curfews. They often responded to community concerns. And it's part of our democratic process that you not only operate a major industrial facility within a community, but that you also respond to community concerns. So this bill would allow the airport, if it wished to do so, to set restrictions on takeoffs and landings from the hours of 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. It does not require the airport to do so, and it also doesn't require the airport to set a curfew of exactly 10 o'clock at night to 7 o'clock in the morning. It could do so, for example, from midnight to 3 a.m. or something like that. But this gives the airport, once again, the authority to be able to control the noise coming off of its property in the most meaningful sense, and that is restricting the planes that are going and the times that they're going to be going often. This is a common approach that other nations take to the noise problem. As noted in our background materials, we have varying degrees of these kinds of curfews around the country. I should also note, Kathleen and I have talked often about how we are impacted in our community by the fact that planes take off when they do here from SFO because they have to beat the curfews in either Japan or China. So there's a transfer effect through public policy onto our community from not permitting our airports to have the same authority that other airports do around the globe. So that's the, again, that's the REST Act for Restore Everyone's Sleep Tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, the last one that I'll do is the Leave Act. And this deals with a lot of the backblast noise. The low frequency noise that we have throughout the community disproportionately impacts some. And there's no forum in which that problem can be addressed other than the Roundtable, which is a fine forum, but there's no forum for actually having legal impact. And this bill would establish a state forum, the state courts, so that groups could go to the state courts and seek remedy, just as they would if they had a nearby industrial facility that was causing some sort of obnoxious outcome within their community. In fact, the nuisance statute of California is the basis for the language of the Leave Act. Obviously, at the moment, this kind of a statute is preempted by federal law. But from the Congresswoman's perspective, these types of impacts on a community need to be addressed by a judicial system that is sensitive to those impacts. The federal courts are impervious to this kind of plea and are, as a practical matter, excused from having to deal with it. So she feels very strongly that there ought to be state court jurisdiction, and this bill would create state court jurisdiction for low frequency energetic acoustics, as we like to call backblast noise. So
thank you, Brian. It's too bad Ann is not on, because there's no greater advocate for addressing the backblast noise than her. So
the irony.
I appreciate that. So thank you.
I know.
Pam, did you have a comment? I'm sorry.
No, I just want to say I have to agree that if Ann was here, that she was such a fighter for this one. This is great, exciting news, is all I can say.
Well, and I just to be clear, because we're going to deal with it a little bit later, do these things become law overnight? Obviously not. They didn't become law in the last session. But until you challenge the conventions of our time, you'll never change them. And up until now, and Kathleen and I did some research on this, we couldn't find legislation in the modern era that tried to challenge the conventions of our time. And that's not because the conventions are good ones. It's because they're deficient and others hadn't tried. And, I work for somebody, Kathleen and I work for somebody who's actually quite interested in challenging conventions that are not working. So that's why we have a lot of good co-sponsors on the bills as well.
Yes.
And that's for me, that's
your section.
That's my section, sorry.
And to follow up on Brian's last comment, I should say that for most of these bills, the co-leads on it are Congresswoman Eshoo and Congressman Panetta, Santa Cruz County. And
so I was going to ask that question. Are they co-authored by our two?
They are co-leads. So they, in essence, are introducing it with her on that same level. Okay. Sarah can better explain it to you. It's more than it's a higher level than a co-sponsor.
Okay.
It's a co-lead.
Co-lead. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So yes, so they are they have been very supportive and remain supportive. So my the bills I'm going to talk about briefly are perhaps more narrowly focused and a bit more prosaic. But the first one is the SHH Act, SHHH, which has to do with the night hush, with which we are all familiar. And although this bill had to be amended since the 2019 introduction of it, of course, to reflect the status of what's going on now, but it still does allow that the FAA, under the bill, would require the FAA administrator and staff to work with the roundtable to complete this project. This procedure would require them to provide staffing and information, and would also reserve the right of the roundtable, if the FAA ever withdrew their proposal, the right of the roundtable to continue and introduce their own night hush through the IFP gateway. So I don't know that any of that will wind up being necessary, as it turns out, but it's there as a backstop. So that's the Hush Act, or the SH Act. And that the next one is somewhat related to that, but is more general in nature, and that's the Apprise Act. And as most of you folks probably know, the FAA generally creates flight procedures through a very detailed and lengthy process, the PBN, the procedure, the performance-based navigation procedure. And this is a 150, 200-page document that outlines everything that needs to be done in order to get a procedure from beginning to end. And in that procedure that's specified, it sets forth who is on what is called the full working group, or there's some subgroups of it. And these are FAA groups that meet to discuss the concept of the flight procedure, where it could go, what altitudes it needs to go, a lot of very technical things, but a lot of basic things like whose house is it going over? Where is it going? Who is it affecting? And the participants on these committees are generally related to the FAA staff, makes sense, or to the industry representatives, the airlines, because they're going to be flying these. And so their technical expertise is important. Can they make that tide a turn? Perhaps, does this work for them? And similar. And the other representatives are the airports, and that's obviously very important. And what's lacking from these committees, sorely lacking, is any community input. Any input that says, if you put that over that stretch of land there, that really impacts a lot of people. If you just moved it over 2.5 miles, would that work? Could we do that? That's the kind of input I would anticipate doing. But this bill would only allow a technical representative from the roundtable to participate. And that takes care of their FAA's concerns that this is a technical committee. And it is, it's a very technical committee during this process. But that isn't to say that a technical representative couldn't represent the community in dealing with technical issues there. So this would be a requirement of the FAA to invite a roundtable technical representative to be on this normally behind closed doors series of meetings that takes place over the 2-year period to develop a procedure. And so you can see the obvious benefit this would be to the community to have this kind of input early in the process before everything's written, chiseled in concrete, because that's basically what happens by the time the public gets any details of these procedures, they are pretty much chiseled in concrete, and you're not going to get much movement on them. So that's the importance of this act. That's the Apprise Act.
The FAA's opposition to that, Kathleen, is that based on size of committee and I mean, if you address the technical concerns that they've expressed, and you've alluded to, we could probably do that through the act that requires a technical representative. What other concerns do they have?
I think that's probably the major concern. I think they're concerned with having a person who's not used to dealing in the technical realm. And I don't mean that they're not smart enough to understand technical issues, but to understand that there are constraints on these procedures. And I think that most of the roundtables can find the type of individual as their consultant that will be an appropriate asset to this committee, because this committee doesn't, I'm sure, want to spend 1.5 years developing a procedure to have the community go, holy moly, you're not doing that to us. Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
So I really think it would benefit everybody to see this input early on in the thing. These PBN meeting groups, and there's the full working group, and then there are, I think, subcommittees of it, are comprised not just of the people I said, but when a question comes up, this altitude is lower than this mountain. Will we have radio reception? I'm sort of making that up, but they will invite radio technical. There's a national organization that deals with that kind of a thing. They will invite those folks to the meeting. So there is, a greater breadth when they want to find out some impact or some other technical aspect from another part of our larger community. So I don't think it's the size of the committees. I just think that they're concerned that they would be dealing with an annoyance to them. And I think they, maybe I'm misstating, maybe they would see it for what it is, which should be a welcome additional voice early in the process.
Good. Thank you.
Pamela, did you have sorry.
Pamela, did you have a comment? I see your.
No, just at this time, I'm just taking notes and then taking in everything, whatever they're saying. Thank you, Chair.
No, your box is lit up on the screener. That's why I thought so.
But I think you addressed, you must have been reading my mind. Your question was spot on. And thank you, Ms. Wentworth.
Thanks, Pamela. Okay, the next one is the Notified Act. And that's the acronym for notify officials to inform fully and impel educated decisions. And that's sort of it in a nutshell. As we know now, there is no effective notification of the public of a new flight procedure. Yes, we have the IFP gateway, but that merely says we are starting the procedure for the ABC procedure. And if you try to get any information about it, or you try to add a note in the public comment section of the box, you will get a form letter saying, this is not open for public comment. We don't want to hear from you, basically. So, and there's no way to get additional information. And until they are at a point where they want to take it to the public. And by then it's mostly chiseled into that concrete. And so I think it's important, and the Congresswoman, definitely wants to see that the local officials are given notice of these procedures. And excuse me, excuse me one second.
No problem.
and be given.
Take a moment to catch your breath there. That's, yeah.
And be given effective notice, not just the IFP. And so this one would require notice to city councils and boards of supervisors, sorry, within 5 miles of the proposed new pathway. Now it's probably less of an issue for us because our roundtable is, pretty much stays on top of these things. But, for people who don't have roundtables, and even for us to get the kind of effective notice, this would be a godsend. So that's the Notified Act for the public officials. Another one that the next one is the Respect Act, which I named after one of my favorite singers' most popular song. That is responsive employees support productive, educated congressional talk. And as you may or may not know, sometimes the FAA is reluctant to get involved with the answering of congressional questions in anything other than a very formal manner through back and forth letters that take months and months. And so this would just remind the FAA that they should engage with the congressional representatives and answer their questions. And I want to stress that, you know, sometimes the FAA is really good about doing this, and other times it's hit and miss. So, this would make.
By the way, if I could add a comment there, I think that's great. My biggest concern with the FAA over the time I've been associated is the sense that they're not acting in concert as a partner to help solve an issue, but rather to defend an action taken. And if there's something that can be written into a bill that would somehow change their required approach, it'd be most helpful, because evidenced by the fact when you ask the question, you get a one-word answer rather than an explanation that can solve a problem. It's no, you can't, rather than, but if you did this. And that's been frustrating if you're a member of the roundtable or a member of the public. So hopefully this is broad enough to cover that. But
it does touch on that. And I think that's been a shorter term relationship with the FAA. Those of us who've been working with the roundtable since, well, at least since next gen 2015 or thereabouts. And I know Brian predates me. I only came on the scene in 2014, but in the office, but Brian predates me by some years. And there was a time when we had TRACON representatives coming to our roundtable meetings, and TRACON air traffic controllers. And they, you know, you'd ask a question and they'd say, oh yeah, we do this, we do this, we do this, and here's why we do it. And it was like, okay, I get that. It makes total sense. And now we have questions filtered through 30 days in advance, asking them in writing, getting someone to the meeting who, while very well meaning, you know, has a different kind of background than as an air traffic controller, and doesn't have the depth of experience that we used to see. And that's I think a big change. And that's where we are today. And that's exactly as you stated it. And that's, and it didn't have to be that way. It used to be a lot different.
Yeah. And I think on that point, the technical working group has been having separate meetings outside of their subcommittee meetings, specifically with FAA technical staff and the chair and our subconsultant, HMMH, the aviation consultant, to talk about specific detailed modifications to proposed procedures and on the fly discussing alternatives and adjustments. So I think that is working outside of the subcommittee meeting, where we get authority to review several options and then meet and then come back and discuss options. But one point on Kathleen's is that our FAA representation requires a 45-day notice if we want them to speak at a meeting. So that's added time. And then whatever you put in your letter specifically is what they will address. So this would be a very welcome modification. Thank you.
And that sounds good to have those private conversations. The only thing I would just say, and this is my own personal opinion, is that sometimes it's good to let important issues and questions see the light of day, and have something on the record, if you will, that can have people be held accountable down the road.
No, I get what I'm saying is that the issue is being discussed and framed in the technical working group, but the details can't be worked out there, and they're seeking a particular clarified outcome. And so that's what we're talking about, and then bringing back what the options are. So it's not loosey-goosey.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. let's see. So that was our.
That was your Respect Act. So I think
that was respect. So that leads me to my last one, which is called the FAIR Act, and that's fairness in airspace includes residents. And this is the one that has the potential to upend the way we do business, the way the FAA does business. There is a section of the US Code which mandates how the FAA will use the United States airspace available, and that they are charged with maintaining it in a way that is safe and efficient. Obviously, no one has any question about the safety. That's paramount, always has, always will be. The efficiency is the second and only second criteria mentioned in that USC code, in that section. There are some other subsidiary areas that mention other things, I'll grant you. So this bill, if enacted, would modify that section of the US code, or US code, that would require that safety, of course, would remain #1 priority, but on a par with and equal to the priority of efficiency would be the environment, including noise impacts on residents. And this, I think, has the potential to change how they do business. Even something as otherwise complex as the performance-based navigation, which was that committee we just talked about, might require that they early on take into account the impact this would have on the environment and the residents, not just down the road when it's chiseled in concrete. And so this would be noise and health inputs and other environmental inputs would be on a secondary equal to efficiency. And I think that would, in over the long haul, and it would probably take some time to revise it, would probably change a lot of the way they do business in creating noise, in creating procedures which result in noise to our residents. And so I think this is probably one of the most important bills we'll see about the FAA and how they do business.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I was going to ask you if you were going to prioritize these bills in terms of efforts by the committee to support them, how you would do it. And obviously, I think they're all worthy of support. But this would be the one that would stand out to me, because it would, once you elevate noise or the pollutant impacts, the environmental impact to the same level of safety and efficiency, now you've got grounding for arguing that changes need to be made at the same level of concentration and input and deliberation that you do in the first two. So this is the bill I really like most of all of them, frankly, personally. I don't know how Pam and Ann feel, but this one I really like, just to be blunt.
Yeah. Well, I think they've all been introduced, and so we'll see what has any legs to take care of. And that's what Sarah's going to talk about, is where do we go from here, and what other options other than the bill that might be available.
Okay. Thank you. Sarah, welcome.
Great. Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Sarah Alptikin. So as Brian and Kathleen have mentioned, I'm the Congresswoman's legislative assistant in DC covering infrastructure issues, which encapsulates the FAA and airport noise. So I was going to go over the general legislative process and kind of the opportunities for moving bills. If you already are aware of any of this, please stop me and I can, skip over and move on to the next thing. But generally, just starting at the top, when you have an idea or a problem that you're trying to tackle, there's a lot of work in advance to introducing a bill. I think sometimes there's a lot of anxiety to get the bill introduced, and that is really important, to make sure it actually happens. But in advance, part of my job is to speak with the committee, speak with any relevant groups or organizations, speak with our legislative counsel who drafts the bills to get their thoughts. Because once a bill is introduced, it's extremely difficult to amend it, and there may never be an opportunity to do that. So you cannot bank on that option. So, if you want to basically hash out any concerns the committee may have in advance, if possible, so that you can get their support. And for those also who may be unaware, there are multiple committees covering different jurisdictions. The relevant one here is the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, chaired by Peter DeFazio of Oregon. So it would be the committee members who assess every single bill that gets referred to that committee and makes their recommendations to the chairman. So they're quite influential. We refer to them as the gatekeepers, basically. So having their support on a bill is huge. So once we get the text, we have the idea, we've done all that, then we circulate it around to other members of Congress and try to get as many co-sponsors in advance to introducing as possible, because the stronger, the larger number of members you have signed on when you introduce, the stronger the bill, seems, and the easier it is to get more support going forward. Obviously, having bipartisanship would be extremely helpful. Sometimes it just doesn't happen, and you can gauge that pretty quickly. And as Kathleen mentioned, there are co-leads and co-sponsors. The point of having co-leads is they basically help advocate at the same level that the bills, we would as a bill sponsor. It's part of their job that we expect them to do, with it compared to a regular co-sponsor. So once a bill is introduced, every bill gets referred to a committee, sometimes multiple. I believe all of these bills are only referred to T&I. And then after that, the bills may be marked up. That is the next step, but not every bill by any means ever gets a markup. But what a markup essentially means is that the committee members convene, debate the bill, hash out their concerns, potentially offer amendments, although it's rare. Usually any amendments that are going to be offered have already been, handled behind the scenes. There are generally not a lot of surprises at a markup, but there can be. So once it gets marked up, then the committee votes to advance the bill. And then once that process is done, it has the ability to be chosen for a floor vote. It may never get a floor vote, and the person who decides that is Leader Pelosi. So, but getting it to markup and getting it past that step is really like the bigger one. Generally, bills are not marked up if there's no chance of them making it to a floor vote. And so the only other time you may potentially rush a bill's introduction is if, let's say, we introduced this 8 package of bills last Congress, for example, and sometimes committee will come to us and say, we're looking to move the bills you introduced last year. Are you planning on introducing them again? And in that scenario, we might push up their introduction, although that would be very thrilling and so far has not happened. So obviously, and then once there's a floor vote, the entire House votes for it, and that would be kind of the final step on our end, and then it's sent to the Senate. So as Kathleen mentioned, there are lots of other avenues, though, through which we can move legislation that frankly tend to be much more productive. And so what you want to look for are big packages of bills. The FAA reauthorization bill, that's only every 5 years, I believe, is the most ideal package for what we're trying to do here. Discussions about what goes into it starts well within a year or two in advance. So it's always good to keep an eye out for those opportunities, and why it's good to advocate for bills like this, even in years where there is no reauthorization, just because it makes the committee members familiar with it so that when it does come up, we don't have to explain it, from the start. Sometimes they will just add in bills in their entirety to these packages. The best is if they just release the draft bill and your bill's already in there, that's great. If not, sometimes they will do an amendment process. They generally do for large packages. Those amendment announcements are very sudden, and we only have 3 days to submit the amendment. An amendment can be an entire bill. It can be 2 words. That's exactly what it is, an amendment. And you want to get the committee support again. You're trying to get their input, you're trying to get the text drafted, and you're trying to hash out any other concerns from any other members within those 3 days before introducing. And then from there, not every amendment is selected. The committee selects some of them, which then get added to the bill. And when you vote on the floor, you vote for the amendments. They usually package the non-controversial ones. So if you've done your work, you want that to be a non-controversial amendment that they put in one big block, and then people vote for it. If it's controversial, but somehow they've still selected it, then you'll have the House vote for it independently, and it's much harder to pass in that situation. Amendments are some of the most relevant and important ways for moving legislation, and pretty much any time we've had that opportunity, we try to include one of our bills, depending on, obviously what the larger package is that's moving. Let's see. So that's generally, how the House works, the general legislative process there. There's also the appropriations process, which I'll talk about momentarily. But right now, I was also going to go over the 2 big bills that are the talk of the town, which is Senate bipartisan infrastructure deal and the reconciliation plan. I did want to pause here though and ask if anyone had questions or if you'd like to do it all at the end, because I know I just said a lot.
I don't have any questions. Pam, do you have any questions at this time?
No, none at this time, Chair. Thank you very much. Thank you for asking.
And Chair, I just wanted to bring to your attention that the bipartisan infrastrucor bill is item 1C on your agenda.
You're correct.
Thank you.
Can be discussed. So did you want to do it in context of that, sir, or do it now?
Whatever you prefer.
Why don't we do it in the context of that, if you don't mind?
Sure.
Because
Yeah.
I think that's, if I'm looking at my agenda correctly, that's the next item. Nope, 2 items down, but it's coming up quickly, so we can combine it all at one time. So don't
Sure.
lose your input. Okay.
Sounds good. And did you have the reconciliation package on there as well? Should I hold off on that one?
We did not, but let's include it at that point in time, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So in that case, the only other piece I wanted to mention about the general legislative process is appropriations, which is when we essentially put together our budget. The appropriations process is kicked off in about February when the president's budget is generally released. It's been postponed this year because of COVID by a few months, but that kind of gets the process going. And it is a very time-consuming and lengthy ordeal. But essentially, part of why I think it gets a little confusing sometimes is because I mentioned that there's a House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. There is a House Appropriations Committee, but then there are subcommittees within that committee that cover in similarly jurisdictions, and they sound almost the same. But for example, the committee that covers FAA or these types of issues would be Transportation and HUD, THUD we call it. And it's important not to get the 2 mixed up because they're for different processes and they have completely different functionalities, so to speak. But essentially, members, during the spring collect input from their districts on funding priorities, and then we relay those priorities to the committee and make our case. Every member does, and then they eventually release, each subcommittee releases a little package of, its recommendations, which are then rolled into one large package. I think what's really important to understand about this process is here we are generally plussing up accounts, just general accounts. If we're trying to target a specific program, for example, getting noise insulation for homes around SFO, that would be considered an earmark, which until this year was banned. So there is an earmark, there was an earmark process this year, but I wouldn't count on that every year. It's not, you know, the same as the general appropriations process, but it's good to understand the two. For example, for airport noise, we would focus on plussing up the airport improvement program account, because that's where SFO gets grant funding for noise mitigation, for noise insulation for homes. It's one of the few federal, you know, programs that somewhat helps with this issue. So while we can't say, please give SFO more money, we can try to increase the overall budget of that account so that there's more money to go all around. And the other piece to this is, because the appropriations bills get so long, they have a separate report where they basically just provide more detail. And those reports aren't legally binding, but they direct agencies on how to use the money. So sometimes there are clever ways to, you know, say, if you said noise mitigation measures in extremely high cost areas with affordable housing, to be, you know, like kind of describe your district in general terms, and that can help as well. So usually the requests during this process are either for an account or for report language.
I just want to do a time check on the agenda as a whole, because there's
that was
for the chair, just in terms of the other speakers and other topics.
Yeah, I think we have 2 more items under this agenda. We've had the discussion now of the process and of the 8 bills introduced by Congresswoman Spire. Before we go to public comment, I'd like to also just briefly discuss the other 2 items on the agenda, one of which you alluded to, Sarah, which was the infrastructure bill. And then secondly was an action item on whether or not we should oppose, support, or do nothing at HR 4892. And that is the reintroduction of the Office of Noise Abatement and Control in the EPA. Is someone going to speak to that, Michelle? Okay. That really is attached as an exhibit, and it's a reintroduction of a bills in the past that would effectively put in a noise abatement office back in the EPA. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that office exists. It just hasn't been funded for the last 40 years or 30 years. And so the real issue there is providing funding for it so it can be effective. And I do know, as your agenda says, that NOISE does support it. I'm trying to understand, I see the pros for it. I don't know the cons. Is there a discussion of why one would not support that? Why we should not support it? Okay, maybe let's wait on action until we get public comment, but that again is attached to the exhibit. And then the third category, which Sarah alluded to, was really just the discussion of the infrastructure bill and what it might mean with respect to the impact on SFO and the roundtable in our communities. That again is attached as an exhibit, if I recall correctly, and this provides funding for airports in particular, some of which I think, and maybe Bert can help me out here if he's on the line, some of it could be used for noise abatement programs. Is that correct? Bert, do you have any comments on that?
As far as the grant funding for mitigation, yes, it can be used for the treatment of homes, provided they are compliant with the FAR and the advisory circular for the Part 150 and mitigation of homes. The other issue that we have to be concerned with are if those contours are forced to change too soon. The reason I say that is with the reduced traffic, contours are smaller, and that could not be beneficial to the community if they were shrunk. So right now, keeping them where they are is a good thing.
Okay. Good point. Okay. Michelle, did you have any other comments you want to add on either HR 4892 or 3684?
I didn't, unless Jean had any particular input, particularly on any opportunities or any pilot programs or any thoughts about collaborations that he's seeing at other roundtables.
Not in terms of the proposed bill. It would just provide more funding, perhaps to AIP eligible projects, and for San Francisco, that really is their sound, noise insulation.
Jean, with respect to that, is it in an area that we ought to explore further about? Are there funds available for certain types of studies around noise that we could be the pilot for it, supported by that funding? And I think Michelle had raised that earlier, is maybe an opportunity for us that we don't want to let pass. Is there something in the bill that would open up the door for us to be the pilot program for some of these, for testing some of these mitigation efforts?
To my understanding, there is not. And it's, again, because it all boils down to what is AIP grant eligible, airport improvement program eligible. And that requires measures from a noise compatibility program. So if San Francisco, for example, had a noise compatibility program measure that said study X, Y, or Z, then they could apply for funds from the AIP to get that. But those aren't in there. Really, the only thing that's in there is maintaining their monitoring system and providing sound insulation to eligible parcels.
Okay. Let me take it to the committee members, see if they have any questions at this point. Pamela, do you have any questions of anything with respect to all three of these items? The 8 pieces of legislation and 4892.
No, just looking for how we can support and see how it really, if there's anything in the bills, like you said, that we can take out, extract, and we know that we can use it for upcoming opportunities or whatever we have to do to support, because this is a movement that we have to keep pushing for. So we want to be very supportive of our Congresswoman and whatever it moves, because if we finally get it introduced, then I think we're an instrument that can be hopefully useful. If the chair finds that as well, that we can do large support.
Okay, I would
and finally get something moving.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think right now, we're going to go to public comment here. If there's any comments, ideas from the public, and then come back to the committee and see what actions should be taken or ideas we might have, if that's agreeable. So with that, let me close the member inquiry portion and move to public comment. Angela, if you could let me know if we have any hands raised. And this is for agenda item number 1, the federal legislation, the 3 categories on the 8 bills by Congressman Spire, 4892 and 3684.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So as a reminder for those on the Zoom video conference, you may raise the hand, press the raise hand feature, or if you're calling by phone, you may press *9 to indicate your desire to speak. And I do have 2 hands raised. I will first call on Ms. Darlene Yapley, followed by Mr. Robert Holbrook. So Ms. Darlene, please accept this request to unmute your microphone and begin speaking.
Thank you so much to
note that our rules are, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much to Rep. Spire and her staff on their support and leadership on the legislation. It's not unnoticed. The attention to detail and the sweet spot you've hit in the bills are really spot on. I just want to make a comment. The infrastructure bill has a lot of language in it that combines funding for airport terminals in the same bucket as sound mitigation. And I'm sure that that's a compromise, but it also is a problem because it is in one bucket. The second thing is there's also a lot of pro-FA language in the infrastructure bill, and I don't know how to get that changed, but a lot of the language is everything is the way it is fine. So that's kind of my net out. For the 2018 reauthorization bill, section 173 and 188 were a failure. And the Quiet Skies Caucus sent a letter to the FAA telling them to redo the metrics report. They also sent a letter in September to redo the metrics report. Is there anything that can be done because they did not meet what the law mandated? So that's my first question. The second is, we know the NES study came out and the more people are annoyed by noise than what the Schultz curve showed. I would like to see either through appropriations or a bill that an independent approach to the DNL standard gets looked at. And that would be funding a National Academies panel to look at a new system of metrics and thresholds. The FAA keeps using a metric DNL, but ANCA says that you need to be looking at a system of metrics. So I would propose that funding be done in a bill or appropriations for the National Academies to look at an alternative to the 65 DNL. And of course, we should also look at this at the reauthorization 2023, which is only a couple years away. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Ms.
Ms.
Yapley.
Yapley.
Mr. Holbrook, please accept this request to unmute your microphone and begin speaking.
Thank you. I'm Robert Holbrook from Mountain View. I'd like to thank Congressmember Spire and her staff for the insightful legislation the Congressmember has introduced and for their collective work to make these important bills real. I agree with the chair and with Ms. Wentworth that the FAIR Act is tremendously important to give the FAA the discretion it needs to consider the interest of residents in some cases. I will add that I believe that issues that are really efficiency issues are not infrequently presented to the community as safety issues. But this act, giving equal weight to environmental and efficiency priorities, would make that determination relevant. I'd also like to applaud the Untitled Arrest Act, which promotes curfews. I strongly support it, but I do wonder if the current situation is necessarily as bleak as it has been presented. I'm not a lawyer, but I have looked at the law regarding curfews, and I am not persuaded that the FAA doesn't have the discretion. Let me say that. I think the FAA might have the discretion to impose curfews under Part 61, but that they have routinely chosen not to. So I'm not sure that this is actually limited by statute, but rather by administrative practice. Of course, if the FAA doesn't change its practices, that amounts to the same thing. Regarding HR 4892, by my reckoning, Congress has voted or is now considering voting for a cumulative total of $90 billion in relief and other funds benefiting the airline industry in the last year and a half. I think it is entirely appropriate that Congress find 1/10 of 1% of that amount to fund for 5 years a noise office within the EPA that has laid dormant for lack of funds for almost 40 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Holbrook. And Chairman, with that, we do not have any hands raised from the public.
Okay, with that, we'll close the public comment on item number 1 and get back to the committee. What I think I'm hearing, and we can revise this and give it more thought, but what I'm hearing is at least two gaps may have appeared, Kathleen and Brian, that we might ask the Congresswoman to consider. One is the metrics issue that Ms. Yapley brought up, and how we effectively provide some sort of methodology to get a greater response on the implementation of that study and the new metrics, system of metrics be devised. And then the second thing, which I did not hear, but I've always been a little bit worried about local authority, whether or not there should be greater discretion given to local agencies, as you alluded to, Kathleen, for like pre-1978, or Brian, maybe you did, that greater weight given to local agencies to have some measure of control over what they can and cannot do locally, flight patterns, curfews, et cetera. That may be implicit, or it may be inferred in one of the bills that the Congresswoman submitted. I forget which one, but I'm not sure it's spelled out exactly. So those are the two gaps I can see. I don't know if Kathleen, Pamela, if you saw any or have any additional ones.
No, I just want to make sure that when you were talking about the local authority, and then the other gentleman was also pointing out about the monies for the EPA, right? to be attributed to that, to reestablish the office of the noise. Yeah.
Yes, and that would solve that problem too, I think. So you could come at it a couple of different ways.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know if there's other.
I'm on the same page.
I don't know if staff has any additional thoughts, but that's what I heard. By and large, I think the 8 bills that Congresswoman has submitted are very comprehensive and specific, and would do wonders to what we're doing. Brian, I see your hands raised. Did you have a comment?
I only wanted to note that prior to federal preemption of local agency choice around curfews, those communities that did choose to have curfews were also those communities that were most impacted by noise, and the voters were within the community. Within the airport's noise boundary.
Yeah.
So it's anomalous when you have a situation like we have here, where the voters that might otherwise put pressure on SFO are actually not able to vote for SFO leadership. But if you take a look at San Jose and San Diego and Irvine in particular, the John Wayne Airport, all of those have both local control and local impact. So they were allowed to be grandfathered in, and after that, the other individual says that there might be FAA authority. We'll take a second look, but Kathleen and I have spent hours with Congressional Research Service and Branch of the Library of Congress on the question is whether or not the FAA still has the authority to impose curfews. I suppose they would in emergency situations, but beyond that, I don't remember that actually being possible. I think it's going to have to come back and be authorized, at least insofar as a local airport is concerned. I know that it will have to be.
Well, I would just, again, there's a pro and con to this. These are ideas that we're sort of broaching, that there may be opportunities there.
Well, there might be other opportunities too for local control. I mean, we could talk about those offline, Mr. Chair.
And when the next topic will be on local issues too. So the other comment, and I would like I'm trying to figure out how we can best help the Congresswoman in these 8 bills. And do you have any ideas? What kind of assistance would you like from us? Because we are willing and able, whether it's writing letters or what it takes to try to provide support. I understand this is an uphill battle. Obviously, we've been introduced in the past, but is there something that you'd like to see from us as a roundtable?
So the Congresswoman and I and my 2 colleagues are all constrained by the rules of the House not to describe in any great depth how to lobby Congress and how to affect Congress. We can't be spending taxpayer time on that. And so they would never allow me to talk in any great depth about other roundtables that might be interested in it, or other local community groups around the country, or all the other mechanisms to bring the legislation itself up on a priority list of the chief decision makers. And I think Ms. Alptikin described to you the chief decision makers in this process. So we're not able to, unfortunately, go into that in any great depth, but it's all the stuff one would expect. And there's great power in numbers, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay. I think I can hear that. So thank you.
Yeah, I think I can hear it too.
I think we obey the rules.
Okay. Before we leave this topic, Kathleen, and Pamela, I think with respect, I know we need a motion, or would like a motion on support of HR 4892, the proposed new office. Do you, Kathleen, need a motion, like a motion to support those 8 bills formally by the roundtable, and a letter in support? Is that something that would be helpful or not?
I hadn't thought about that. Is that something, I don't know that that's something we could request, even if it were beneficial.
You probably can't, based on what Brian just said, but we may want to give some thought to that. But let's.
It probably would not hurt, Chair, right?
I'm sorry?
It probably wouldn't hurt.
Probably wouldn't hurt. I don't think it would hurt if we could draft a letter of support for this. So let's take them one at a time. Pamela, you're the only other voting committee member.
That's okay.
Could I entertain a motion to support the proposed new office of noise abatement and control in the EPA, House Bill 4892, that we could then send to the roundtable as a recommendation for support from the roundtable?
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion and a second.
Okay, you make that motion, I'll second it.
Okay,
Let's take a vote on that. You for it, I assume?
I support it. Yes, that would be a yes.
And I would vote yes too. So unfortunately, Ann's not here, but we do have a quorum with the two of us. So we will send to the roundtable a recommendation from this committee that we support House Bill 4892. Secondarily, I would like to also do the same with the 8 bills proposed by Congressman Spire, that the roundtable formally supports those 8 measures, and we sent a letter so indicating.
With the modifications that you said verbally, or just as is?
As is. When you say verbal modifications, you meant?
You referenced the metrics issue that Yapley brought up, as well as.
No, let's just do the 8 as a recommendation. I raised those other 2 just for consideration by the Congresswoman to see whether or not there's some gaps there.
Thank you.
And not a formal action. I'd like to have the Congresswoman give some thought to that. There may be some pros and cons of that. So is there a motion, Pamela, for the approval of the 8 bills?
There's a motion to support the 8 bills by the Congresswoman Jackie Spire.
And I will second that. So all in favor?
Aye.
Aye, and I say aye, so that supports too. This is interesting. We only have 2 members of a 3-member committee. So, but this is a subcommittee. So again, these are
small but mighty.
These are recommendations that will go to the roundtable for the roundtable vote for final action on it. But that's what we're doing here. So we'll be prepared to discuss it. I think we've had a good discussion on this topic. I think there's some follow-up items with respect. I would like to follow up a little bit more. Jean, despite your comments on pilot programs and funding, I'd like to understand that a little bit more. So perhaps we can discuss that offline and just make sure that we're not missing any opportunities. There's a lot in that infrastructure bill, as Sarah alluded to, and I'd like to make sure that nothing's there that we're going to regret later on not having explored further. So perhaps we can look at that from a pilot program perspective. With that, let's close agenda item number 1 and move to agenda item number 2. This is an area that we're trying to understand. We have 20 minutes left in the meeting. Want to understand what opportunities may exist with respect to our influencing of an advocacy around state or local legislation or local actions. I'd like to understand exactly, and this came out of by the way, this came out of some comments made by the presenter at the last meeting, Peter Kirsch, talked about what it was being done locally in a couple different cases. But it struck the issue about, is there some opportunities for us to do something locally or at the state level that we haven't really thought of or spent much time thinking about, and maybe we should. I'm sensitive to the fact that what Brian just said is that local may have limited impact because the impact of the airport noise may be well beyond any single jurisdiction. But to the extent we can see what's going on around the rest of the country, it may open up some ideas for us. So with that, I think, Jean, you're going to perhaps lead us in a discussion on this. So let me turn the floor over to you.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to basically introduce the subject just overall to try to
and Jean, your vocals are going in and out, by the way.
Yeah, I was afraid of that. Let me know if I have to repeat anything. I'll do my best here. I had to use my computer the way this was set up. I couldn't dial in by phone also. So anyway, because of the federal regulations that are in existence, it is where in terms of aircraft noise, it is regulated at a federal level, meaning that local jurisdictions, while they do have community noise regulations, almost all of them point to the fact that they cannot regulate transportation noise, including aircraft noise. And so they're exempt. Their regulations on noise, community noise levels and limits, aircraft noise is exempt from those. And then on the state level, basically there aren't any also legislative things, although state of California does have one, and that's Title 21, which the FAA has accepted the use of the CNEL metric in determining land use compatibility rather than using the DNL. And that's because Title 21 was in effect before the FAA came up with their system of measurements for aircraft noise in the Part 150 process. And so while there is opportunity there, you could think about, whether there's opportunity to modify, update, replace Title 21 with the state of California. Since there is that regulation already in effect, you could perhaps update that. So you'd want to look at what exactly is Title 21. And Title 21 is really a mechanism for counties to designate airports as having a noise problem if they can show that there are non-compatible uses within the 65 CNEL contour. And so it then also lays out how you determine where that 65 CNEL contour is, how you set up a noise monitoring system to determine that, and then also how the airport would apply for and operate with a variance if they have impacts within their noise impact boundary, which is again the 65 CNEL. So I just wanted to lay the framework out there, kind of lay the base case here, and then start the discussion with the panel here and what we might want to talk about further after this. So hopefully that was helpful. And that's what I was prepared to at least, discuss at the beginning of this section.
Okay, thank you, Gene. Do you know of any actions that have been taken by local jurisdictions around the country and any specific actions they've taken and how that's been received? What's happened to those?
Yeah, and I think Brian alluded to this a little bit in what he was saying earlier, Brian Perkins, that is, and that prior to the passage of the Airport Noise and Capacity Act in 1990, airports were able to take local control of their operations and actually do, restrictions and things like that. But since then, you cannot. But so, you can impose a restriction right now, like some airports, and actually many in California have right now, but you can't do that now without going through a Part 161 process, which is a airport use and access and use restriction, I think is what it's called. And so there is a way there, but the FAA has clearly made it known that they intend to not approve such restrictions, because even some have been relatively simple and hardly any negative detriment to that, and they still have not accepted that. So, so there has been legislation, but it was all occurred and grandfathered in prior to 1990.
So it's all grandfathered legislation, and nothing since 1990 that's been effective that you're aware of locally.
No, however, there have been lawsuits, right? Legal cases brought against the FAA if they make changes or do things differently. We've seen some of that. One of the recent ones was when the city of Los Angeles just did a lawsuit with FAA, and they have to go back and actually do more public outreach on their procedures.
Okay. Pamela, did you have any questions regarding this?
Just a couple of things. Thank you to the chair. Thanks, Eugene, for the information. I remember, I'm not sure, I'm sure you recall that Title 21 has come up a few times at our SFO Roundtable. And I don't know if people would be interested in at least going back over it. I remember several comments. I believe Supervisor Pine at one point, and some other people referring to it and indicating, I'm not sure if he did, don't want to misspeak, of maybe they could be updated or reviewed. So that's something to entertain, if you will, through the chair, that might be something to take a look-see until we try to figure out other ways to gain more access.
I think that's a great suggestion. I think Title 21 has come up. I don't think we've ever spent a lot of time going through it in detail. Michelle or Linda, perhaps you can correct me on that. But I'm trying to understand if it's a tool that could be used. Do we understand it well enough to use it, and how could it be used? And there may be some public comments on that, but
And I think Jean can update us on that topic as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and I know Title 21 fairly well. It's something that I could, spend more time on, and maybe even put together a presentation for this body if you wanted to at an upcoming meeting or something. Because I think it is, San Francisco International Airport is a noise problem airport designated that by the county of San Mateo. So it's important to understand what that means, and also most as important is what it doesn't, right? So really understanding that makes a lot of sense for any roundtable that's working with an airport that has been designated as a problem airport by the county.
So let's add that for a discussion at the next meeting, because I think it'd behoove us to understand that and see from a legislative or aspect if how that could be maybe helpful to us. So, but what I'm hearing and what I'm hearing you say is that there may be limited access from a local ability, local ordinances, but there may be something through Title 21 at the state level that may be helpful.
The one thing that I just thought of actually, Chair, is that FAA currently allows for the local jurisdictions to implement lower noise levels than the 65 DNL or CNEL in the case of California. And so that is an opportunity that the local legislatures could do. You would have to show that you find certain noise sensitive properties incompatible with noise at lower levels, and actually show that you as a jurisdiction are enforcing those rules, meaning you don't allow for new residential property to be put into an area that's below the 65 CNEL if you do actually enact something like that. So that is something that is allowed through the federal regulation, and that is for local jurisdictions to adopt lower noise standards. And I could talk more about that too.
Yeah, and I think let's follow up on that. It's not that we're going to advocate we do or don't do. We just want to understand it better. Pamela, do you have a comment on that?
No, I think it's an excellent idea, and I appreciate it to break it down, and never know what we can find once it's broken down.
Yeah, and I'm sensitive.
Thank you, Chair.
And again, I'm sensitive to trying to do this on a more than a city by city basis. So we'll have to figure out how we would coordinate that. Pam, if you have if no further questions, let's go to public comment. I'd like to get public comment on this before we run out of time. So with that, let's open public comment and see if there's any hands raised. I'm hopeful there's some input from the public that would be helpful here too.
Thank you, Chair. I do have one hand raised for members of the public. So I will call on Mr. Robert Holbrook.
Okay, Mr. Holbrook.
Thank you. I have thoughts on this one too. My understanding is that the basis for federal preemption of state and local law is the Commerce Clause, which regulates the commerce between the states. And that this explains in part why local jurisdictions, cities and counties, maintain discretion over land use decisions. Obviously, a great deal of commercial aviation traffic is between state boundaries. But there's a new class of air vehicles that, if reports are to believe, are rapidly emerging, and that includes unmanned aerial vehicles and drones. And the forecast for these can be breathtakingly large. The vast majority of those flights, I believe, are going to be local to the state. And so the basis in the Commerce Clause is not nearly as strong for this class of traffic as it is for aircraft. California auto regulations, California's able to regulate autos. I believe that may have happened because they were on this issue early, and the existing regulations were respected by the time the federal government got around to implementing them. The state of California has a great interest, and all states have a great interest in the jurisdiction for these flights, particularly at the lowest altitudes, 200 to 400 feet, 400 to 800 feet. I believe this is a question that the state should study and consider advancing with urgency. The Roundtable might wish to consider encouraging our state government to take up this issue. I expect that the FAA will assert as much jurisdiction over these flights as it feels it can get away with. And lacking pushback from states, I expect they will be successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holbrook. I think your point's well taken. In fact, when we talk about future topics, I think unmanned aircraft definitely needs to be on that list pretty quickly. And your recommendations well taken. Are there other hands raised?
Yes, Chairman, we have a hand raised from Ms. Darlene Yapley.
Okay. Darlene, Ms. Yapley, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just wanted to reinforce the comment. There is a tremendous amount of activity about drones and all types of flying objects that are going to affect people in the vicinity of the airport, which also includes where they're going to park. So that's almost like a parking lot area, and then they take off from there and then they go all around the area. So I think this is an emerging area where there will be state and local control. And I encourage, as Robert mentioned, looking at it, because even though it's not finalized, this is the time that you need to get involved before it starts getting inked. Thank you.
Well taken. Well point. Thank you. Other points?
Chair, we do not have any more hands raised.
Okay, let me close the public comment on this, and I appreciate it. I think what I'm hearing is an area we should explore a little bit further, both with respect to Title 21 and with respect to the exception for land use, or the lower level ground-based frequency, I guess I'll call it, that Jean pointed out. And well is we need to discuss the emerging trend of unmanned aircraft. So maybe for the next meeting, those would be three things we need to explore further. But no, this again was information discussion only, no actions required here, but I appreciate it. We have 5 minutes.
I do want to just raise
yes.
one thing just
Yeah.
to bring to your attention, in that the legislative subcommittee description was a focus on federal legislation. And so when we take those 2 letters to the membership, that will be part of the discussion as proposed changes to the description of the committee to focus more on state and local legislation as well as federal legislation, so that they have a clear understanding of that expansion of scope.
Actually, Michelle, thank you very much. That's a great point. I do think we ought to request an amendment to our charter to include legislation and advocacy at governmental levels, not exclusive to federal. So Pamela, I presume you agree with that, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, I definitely think, thank you, Michelle. That's excellent. Yes, we needed to, I think it's great to bring that forward. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Michelle.
Great, thank you. Last 2 things on the agenda, I just wanted to note real quickly. There is attached to the exhibit, the ground-based noise subcommittee letter to Steve Dixon. The ground-based committee met, and they did send a letter that's attached. Since both Pamela, I, and Ann serve on the ground-based committee, and we were in support of the letter, I think this committee is represented in what they did. So the recommendation was it went directly from ground-based to the roundtable. They approved it. It was sent and received. So that's attached. The second comment, I want to just get quick feedback on item number 4 on your agenda, and that's future committee activities. There's a couple listed there. We've added one right now, unmanned aircraft, and we've added a follow-up in more detail on Title 21 and local opportunities. The fifth thing that we had originally thought about talking, and I think we need to add it again based on my conversation with Michelle earlier today, and that's supersonic aircraft. We took it off because we were told by the FAA that nothing new has happened since we last discussed it. Well, I noted a news report here a couple of weeks ago about some business being formed in which they're developing supersonic aircrafts, and United had already placed orders for them as well as others. So there's obviously some activity taking place with supersonics, and I think it behooves us to try to figure out for sure what's going on and be in the front of that, not at the end of it. So I think that may be a topic for a future meeting. Are there any other topics that we should be exploring? Pamela, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I think it's well thought out and timely. Timely is, like you said, being in front and not when it's already happened.
Yeah.
And not listening to someone tell us to wait.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. We have.
Chair, if I could comment just briefly.
Yes, please, Jane.
One of the things to look into is advanced air mobility. It takes into account vertical takeoff and landings. It takes into account drones. It takes into account all the things. So I just wanted to let you know that the term out there is advanced air mobility. And so that's what you'll want to focus on for those things.
Okay. Advanced air mobility is a proper terminology? Okay.
Yes, advanced air mobility is actually the correct term there. So if you're Googling things and things like that, I just wanted to point that out. You'll find a lot more information.
Wow.
Thank
and
you.
Then, yeah, and then in terms of supersonic, to the FAA, there isn't anything happening because they react to legislation. And if this committee wants to be proactive in legislation, obviously you want to keep abreast of what is happening in the industry, what's happening, and so I think you're right, Al. And what you brought up is that we should stay tuned into that, because you'll want to certainly be a part of, proposed legislation when that comes, right? So I think it is worth following for sure.
Yeah, I thank you. I totally agree. I would ask the public if they have any topics that they think this committee should consider for a future meeting. We'd welcome your input on it. I'm not sure we have time right now. We only have 3 minutes left, but if you could just send an email to Michelle or to myself or to Pamela, we'll be sure to try to forward it and put it on the list to consider. Although I think we have 3 topics right now that will clearly cover our next meeting. So
clearly.
Yeah, with that, let's move to the last item, and that's to close. Before I close, I wanted to see if there's any comments by the committee or by the staff on anything we discussed or should be thinking about. So Pamela, do you have any final comments before we adjourn?
No, I just want to thank everyone on the committee and Congresswoman Spire and all her great work with the staff, with Brian and Kathleen and in DC and everything, because I like the legislation. Also, I know that was well thought out and that they put a lot about the residents, and that to me was really refreshing, because a lot of legislation that's put forth does not really include residents sometimes. And so that is refreshing. And thank Michelle and everyone and yourself, Chair, for all everyone with their public comments, welcoming the public and their information, their knowledge is a great help and really appreciated and welcomed. So thank you very much, and look forward to moving forward and being proactive with this wonderful chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you.
Any comments from staff? Michelle or Linda or Jean? Any comments you might have?
None for me.
None? Okay.
No, I'm good.
Okay. Well, then let me just again echo what member Pamela said, and that Giovanni said, and that is thank the presenters today. I really appreciate the time and effort went into it. I think we have a couple action items coming out of it, but more importantly, I think we have some major topics that we need to delve into. They may provide opportunities for us, so we'll do so. With that, we will adjourn the meeting. I thank you for your time. We're exactly at 1:29, so promised you 1:30 and we have met it. So meeting's adjourned. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bravo. Thank you, everyone.